Jane Curtis. I was with the Northwest Oregon Ecology Program for 30 blessed years, and now I call myself semi-retired because I'm with the ACES program. And I'm very humbled to be asked to talk about fire's role in the Willamette National Forest landscapes, past, present, and future. So today I'm going to cover some of the overarching key ecological functions of fire, as well as what drives fire on our landscape and what some of the common fire effects are. Then I'm going to look to the past to see how what fire's role in our past landscapes were, look at how we're interacting with fire today, and then take a look at what the potential role of fire might be in our future. Then I'm going to hand it over to Matt, and he's going to talk about, given what we know about our current and future fire relationship, how can we develop strategies for creating resilient landscapes? I know I'm biased, but I do believe that fire probably is one of the, if not the most dominant process operating on our landscapes, and it operates at a variety of spatial and temporal scales. As fires, well, fires perform many functions, and as fires are burning, most of what they do is kill vegetation, and they also remove biomass. And that biomass can be anywhere from the forest floor as the fire is consuming litter and duff, to the tops of crowns as fire is consuming needles and fine fuels. Fire also, as it's burning, volatilizes carbon, nitrogen, and other elements into the atmosphere. Once the smoke settles, one of the most obvious effects of fire is creating lots of dead biomass. And probably the most obvious dead biomass that folks see in our part of the world is standing dead snags, and which eventually fall down and become downwood. And those structures are really perform really important functions. They may provide microclimate protection for our germinating conifers and hardwoods. They also provide key unique habitat for wildlife species, and they enhance and continue nutrient cycling and future soil development. Fires also create growing space of various sizes, and that growing space could be occupied either by species that actually were in the area before the fire, and also it provides opportunities for new species to develop. And because of all this, I'd say fire again is a key process that's providing opportunities for diversity, and that diversity can occur either at the site to the landscape level. A key way to look at how fire interacts with our landscapes, as well as what drives fire, is to really take an ecosystem approach. So not only do we need to take a look at the elements of an ecosystem, be it the non-living or abiotic elements of climate, geology, landforms, topography, and soils, we also need to look at the biotic elements of plants, animals, and yes, people. And I would say that equally as important is to look at how those elements are relating to each other and how that affects fire. So some of you may be familiar with the fire behavior triangle, which speaks to the components that are important as a fire is burning. I think those very elements can be used when we take a longer, more ecosystem approach to looking at the drivers of fire. So weather and topography and fuels translates then to climate and landforms and topography and vegetation composition, structure, and pattern. So we'll be talking about each one of those. Climate is incredibly important, and it's got a very direct and indirect relationship with fire. Not only the overarching precipitation and temperature regimes, but how those are distributed seasonally really affect fire's movement through the landscape. So as you can see from the left panel, there is a fair amount of variability in summer climate across our landscapes. And that has a direct relationship to fire because on a variety of fronts, climate, especially fire season climate, really drives one of our key ignition sources, being lightning. Climate also plays a huge role in influencing what kinds of plants and plant communities grow across our landscape and what is vegetation but fuels. And fire also indirectly affects other processes like drought and insects and pathogens, which play a huge role in fire's movement across the landscape as well. And I really like this graphic to illustrate the relationship between fire and climate. Weisberg and Swanson pooled all of the information from our fire history studies on the west side, largely of Oregon, and calculated how many acres burned through time over a quarter century intervals. They then calculated an average burn across the time period. And you can see that as the horizontal line up here at 20%. Then they went ahead and placed the acres burned through time, as you can see on the x-axis. And you can see some interesting patterns. So areas of well above average burning occurred during the 1500s, which frankly, that time period is the time period that many of our old trees regenerated in, and the mid-1800s to early 1900s. And then conversely, there was a period where we had well below average fire activity. So as you can see from the bubble up above, these periods are interacting very directly with climate, with the above average fire activity occurring in warm climate periods and the below average fire activity occurring at the height of the Little Ice Age. So I think most folks can see the direct influence of topography and fire. So it makes sense that our southerly aspects receive more solar radiation, and consequently fuels might dry out a little earlier in the fire season. And then as a fire is burning, the steeper the slope really influences the amount of preheating that fuels receive before the actual fire moves through. So it makes sense then when we take a slightly larger ecosystem look at things, that the arrangement of those aspects and slopes in the form of landforms would really affect how fire moves through the system and what the fire effects would be. And fuel structure, both vertical and horizontal, really influences the kinds of fire that might occur in an area. So for instance, an area with very grassy understories with overstories that are pretty open with crowns that are pretty short, so a long distance between the ground and the edge of the crown, really have a tendency to limit fire to that ground surface. And we see these kinds of stand structures at the south end of the Willamette, as well as further to the south. If we have a fuel structure or vegetation pattern that's similar to that I've just described, but also includes gaps and places where we might have more of a shrubby understory with perhaps sapling and pole regeneration occurring in very patchy fashion. Then we have what's called a surface fire, where a fire moves along the surface of slightly above the ground, and also might have an opportunity, a limited opportunity, to move up into the canopies of trees, and that's called kind of a passive crown fire. And then we have situations where we have a multi-canopy condition where crowns are touching, of trees are touching, and that allows for not only movement of fire from the ground surface up into the canopies, but it also allows for fire to move along the canopies of the trees for a great distance, and that's called a active crown fire. So structure really affects the kind of fire we see, and the composition of vegetation can really affect how species react to fire. So fire severity, so it affects mortality, and thus that ends up affecting vegetation pattern as well. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit in using adaptation strategies that species have to describe what you might expect in terms of fire severity. I do want to point out that individual species may have more than one adaptation strategy over the course of their life, and I've just selected the most representative adaptation strategy to illustrate this. So a key adaptation strategy that many of our shade-tolerant species exhibit over their lifetime is to avoid fire or run away. And species like western hemlock, mountain hemlock, and Pacific silver fir exhibit this strategy. So they often have thin bark. They have crowns that extend down almost to the ground surface. Like I said, they're shade tolerant, and especially in high elevation systems, they're very shallowly rooted. So the result of them interacting with fire is pretty much high mortality. And as you can see from these two examples from the Warner fire, it doesn't take much to kill these trees. Conversely, we have those species that are able to resist fire. So they often develop thick bark at a pretty early age. Often they grow in open places, so they're shade intolerant. And another key characteristic is that they have short crowns. So there's a pretty long distance between the ground and where the bottom of the crown is. So resistor species are species like Douglas fir, incense cedar, sugar pine, ponderosa pine. So in cases of surface fire and even passive crown fires, these species are often able to persist and make it through. However, no species is asbestos. So once you get into an active crown fire, then you will see some high mortality. And then we have evader species like Ceanothus, which has seeds that exist in the soil for long periods of time and actually require some kind of heat scarification to germinate. So they're able to take advantage of the of the post-fire growing space immediately. And another evader species trait is to, like knobcone pine, is to have cones with really sticky resin that's around them that requires some kind of heat to melt that, pop the cone, and then they're able to germinate immediately after a fire. And we have actually are starting to see a fair amount of knobcone pine in the central to southern part of the Willamette. We have a research natural area, as a matter of fact, that's basically a knobcone pine forest. So these species may, like I said, in knobcone pine case, the adults may die, but they're ready to recolonize the site. And I don't have lodgepole pine in here because there is some controversy around whether lodgepole pine, in fact, has serotinous cones, but it may. Many of our mature and old growth shrub and herb species fall into the endurer adaptation category. So they may in fact die or be top killed due to a surface fire. However, they are able to sprout immediately after the disturbance and come back reinvigorated. And you can also see this in some of our hardwood species like madrone and chinkapin as well. So knowing what we know about plants and their adaptation traits, and then they make plant communities, it makes a lot of sense that we would want to know something about how those communities are distributed in space and time, because that'll give us information not only on how they've interacted with past fire, but also give us some predictive power in terms of how they may interact with current and even future fire. A pretty elegant way, I think, of describing the role of fire across a landscape is by talking about a fire regime. And a fire regime describes kind of the representative frequency. So in general, how often does a fire occur across an area? The representative severity, so how much mortality has that site experienced through time, which again is kind of related to the kinds of fire as well as the fire effects. And then how large of an area was affected in any one time. And as I've just said in the previous slides, this gives us information not only about the fire itself, but also about the composition, structure, and pattern of our landscapes. So as you can see from the map on the right here that's taken from the Northwest Forest Plan synthesis, we have three general fire regimes that occur across the Northwest Forest Plan area. And even though the frequent low severity regime isn't mapped on the Willamette, it does occur, and I'll talk about each one of these separately. So the infrequent high severity fire regime that's in blue in the map here is one that doesn't occur very often, but when it does, it's pretty intense in terms of producing high mortality over very large tracts of land. This particular fire regime is most common, as you can see from the map, in our cooler, higher elevation Pacific silver fir sites and in our mountain hemlock forests along the Cascade Crest. There often is several centuries of fire-free periods between fires. And I'm going to illustrate that using this landscape view taken from the Scott Mountain Lookout in 1933. And I wanted to point out for those of you not familiar These Osborne historic panorama photos are really invaluable, and I put the link here so you can access them. They're photos taken across, I think, the entire Northwest that the Nature Conservancy has compiled, and really give you a good landscape view of pattern and some historical context. So I took a stab at least illustrating what this infrequent high severity fire regime might look like here. So the yellow patch is supposed to illustrate the effect of a single fire in this landscape. And as you can see, it's quite large in extent. And the little red patches are potentially some lightning ignitions that fire conditions weren't conducive to spread. So just kind of pooped around in the ground and created these finer scale patterns. So if we think about how these systems might operate in space and time, we have these large tracts of land that are all going to grow up together, that are basically going to slowly move from early Seral to mid-Seral to late Seral over centuries and then burn again. The variable frequency mixed severity fire regime that's in tan here is one of our more common fire regimes. And you'll see it mostly throughout our western hemlock and lower elevation Pacific silver fir forests. It's incredibly variable, as the name suggests, in both frequency, with mean fire return intervals of 50 to 150 years, with really mixed fire severities, both within individual fires as well as through time. So I'm going to illustrate this just conceptually. So let's take this old landscape, and let's take a look at what the effects of a single fire might be. So we may see some evidence of high severity patches, so high mortality, greater than 70% of the patch. And we know from fire history information and the relationship between climate and fire that some of those patches might be rather large. There also are going to be some areas that experience moderate severity patches, 30 to 70%. Those might be areas that had some passive crown fire or that had surface fire in places that had shade-tolerant species that dominated. And then we're going to see areas in blue that had the low severity, so less than 30% mortality. So if you look at, this is the pattern from one fire. So it's somewhat of a complex pattern. So imagine 2, 3, or more fires have moved through this landscape over time with slightly different proportions of severities in slightly different distributions and patch sizes. So imagine how complex the landscape might look. And in fact, Alan Tepley took a stab at this by looking at many stands in the West Cascades and trying to get a handle on how fires affected stand structure and succession through time. And as you can see from this graphic, it's pretty dang complicated. What he found was about a quarter of the stands that he looked at had what most folks think of West Side forest succession, where, and similar to the infrequent high severity fire regime, where you had complete mortality and then stands would move through time, get old only to burn again. And these stands that he looked at were found in very protected valley bottoms, as well as topographically protected areas. the other end of the spectrum, about 10% of the stands that he captured were in this, what he called kind of a chronic fire condition, where they had fire moving through their area incredibly frequently. Any kind of discrete age classes across the landscape. And obviously, most of the stands were probably populated by the resistor species. And these stands were found on southerly aspects on the upper third of slopes, often just below more pronounced ridge lines. By far and away the most common expression and stand trajectory pattern that he found was in this moderate severity, kind of more frequent fire, where there were episodic fire occurring across the landscape, but the episodes were discrete enough that he was able to determine one to several understory cohorts. So a stand might receive one to several non-stand replacing events over its life. And the cohorts could consist either of shade tolerant species, as you see in this lower right-hand panel here, in fire conditions where fires were less severe and they didn't kill enough of the overstory or burn up enough of the litter and duff on the site that these shade-tolerant species like western hemlock and Pacific silver fir were able to generate. And in other conditions where you did have those larger mortality patches where fire burned most of the litter and duff and you were left with mineral soil, that would favor Douglas fir cohort to develop. And there were no topographic affinities to this suite of stand types. So it was somewhat random in nature somewhere on the slope. And as I said before, although we did not map the frequent low severity fire regime, there is evidence that it occurred on the south end of the Willamette. And it makes sense because as we're starting to move down to the south end of the Willamette, we're starting to see some climatic shifts moving from a moister, cooler condition to a warmer, drier condition that's a lot more representative of areas to the south. And in parallel to this, and because of this, we also start to see evidence of our warmer, drier vegetation types like the Graham fir and Douglas fir types. And they're often found on these southerly, lower elevation, drier aspects. So we start seeing a higher preponderance of sugar pine, ponderosa pine, and even Oregon white oak. And we have some historical evidence in terms of how fire might have interacted with these landscapes. For instance, the Government Land Office surveyors that inspected this area in the mid-1800s found some areas of open canopy forest. About 6,000 acres of these were recorded as Doug fir, ponderosa pine savanna with very grassy understories. And about 550 acres of this landscape were in open condition because of stand replacement fires. I do want to point out that these surveyors were really keying into certain elements and weren't really looking at potentially the less than stand replacement portions of fires. So it could very well be that fire influenced quite a bit more of this landscape than was recorded. And James Johnston has started a fire history project because of what we've been seeing down at the south end of the forest, where he has been coring or sectioning close to 900 trees, I believe, and dating fire scars from those trees. And what his initial results have shown us is that, yes, fire has been a very frequent visitor to these stand types, especially in the dry pine type with oak with 5-year mean fire return intervals. And he went ahead and imputed the results of his fire history work to some of the Rigdon area. And as you can see, some of it really mirrors the distribution of the vegetation types in terms of the drier Grand Fir and Doug Fir series, but also we're probably finding some of our more frequent mixed severity fires occurring in the western hemlock zone down in the south end. So if we think about how these forests develop, some of them really mirror what is more common to the south of us and to the east of us. Even probably had areas of open forest, as you can see from this left-hand panel here, which is really describing an east side ponderosa pine type, but I think it's pretty appropriate for here. So probably more open conditions with potential gaps of regeneration, allowing for fire to move probably mostly as surface fire across the landscape. And then at Jims Creek, when we did some reconstruction of the pre-settlement forests in the area, found that along the south, exposed south aspects, much more open conditions than occurs today, with Oregon white oak really dominating the landscape in more of a savanna kind of condition. Whereas in more protected, more mesic microsites, we found that Oregon white oak was joined by ponderosa pine, Doug fir, and incense cedar in a little more dense conditions, but still relatively open. And I would be remiss if I did not talk about the role of people in fire. We have a lot of evidence of people moving through our landscape for centuries. We have a lot of evidence of pre-contact or native people occupying and utilizing our forests. For instance, if in this photo here, you can see many of the ponderosa pine that exists down in the south end of the Willamette have this scarring pattern. And these trees have been culturally modified by pre-contact people where they peeled the bark and utilized the cambium for either medicinal or food purposes. And we have evidence from other places that that Native Americans used fire to really actively manage forests, either to encourage certain kinds of vegetation like Oregon white oak for food purposes, or to encourage wildlife, certain wildlife species to enhance hunting opportunities. When Europeans began to settle the area, they utilized fire similarly to pre-contact people, using it to clear and maintain open areas, and also to encourage and maintain forage for livestock. We have evidence of many meadows across the Willamette, not all, but some having been burned on a pretty regular basis for sheep grazing. As more and more people began to move into Western Oregon, and actually across the nation in general, there was a real appreciation of the recreation qualities that natural forests provided. And there was a real push to try to preserve those qualities. So in 1891, the Forest Reserve Act was set up to do just that. And locally in our area in 1893, the Cascade Range Forest Reserve was formed. And that spanned pretty much from the Columbia River to almost all the way down to the California border. And it was modified in the future. So there was a real appreciation, as I said, for all the things that natural forest provided, from recreation to grazing to providing timber. And with the big burn happening in 1910, where basically about 3 million acres burned through Idaho, Montana, and Washington in about 3 days, there grew a lot of concern and fear about the effects of fire and how it was interacting in a very negative way with our landscapes. So by the 1920s, there were some pretty intense fire suppression policies that were established and implemented across our landscapes. So some of you, and I remember this, might be around to remember the 10 a.m. policy where fires needed to be put out by 10 a.m. of the day they were found, or at least the day after. And then towards the latter part of the 1900s, research was coming out to really show some of the beneficial qualities of fire. And meanwhile, people were moving into the wildland-urban interface as well. And so there was a bit of a loosening of these total fire suppression policies. And then we had the Yellowstone fires of 1988 that, again, burned lots of land and burned up lots of houses. And so the fire suppression policies came back into effect. And fire suppression has obviously affected stand and landscape structure, both vertically as well as horizontally. It's pretty obvious to see in the lower right-hand panel here how fire suppression has affected some of our really frequent fire regime areas like Ponderosa Pine. And I would state that fire suppression has also affected our more mesic forest types as well in a little more nuanced way. So I wanted to kind of take a look at what opportunities in our modern world we've had for fire activity. The left-hand panel here represents lightning ignition start fires that were suppressed over a 10-year period that are in the black dots. And then fires that we weren't so successful at suppressing that are in the red blobs, that are the larger wildfires. So this covers the complete Northwest Forest Plan area. And you can see there's quite a few black dots and red blobs in this over this 10-year period. Well, we went ahead and dove in, as you can see from the map here of just the Willamette, to take a look at what our lightning ignited fire starts that were suppressed and not suppressed were over the period of record. So we were able to look at from 1970 to just last year of what our landscape looked like. And as I have down here, we had close to 4,000 lightning ignited starts that over a 50-year period, which kind of translates to somewhere between 75 and 80 lightning fire starts per year across our landscape. And we also have evidence, as you can see from the different colored polygons here, of larger wildfires, with obviously the most recent fires being the largest. across our landscape as well. Um, so to illustrate the effect of potential fire suppression, I would say that if only a few of those red dots had burned a little bit more across the 50-year time period, our landscape pattern would look a lot different than it does today. And if we think about it in terms of the effect over the historical fire regimes, as you can see here, where we looked at suppressed lightning fire starts over a 20-year period, you can see that fires have been suppressed in all the fire regimes that we see across our area, and no surprises that fire effects are more pronounced from a suppression perspective as we get more frequent in our fire regime categories. And when Matt Riley and his cohorts looked at our modern fire regimes, they really found that our modern fire regimes are definitely a lot less frequent than they were historically. And in parallel with that, when we do have fires, we are seeing increases in the higher severity fire expression across our landscape. And that high severity fire suppression is often occurring in larger and larger patches across our landscape. So that's today. So let's start thinking about the future. And I do want to say that, well, since fire and climate are so intertwined, it makes sense that we might kind of take a look at what the future climate is showing us. And I want to say that future climate isn't necessarily something that's 50 or 100 years down the road. We're seeing expressions of it happening today. Well, if just the last week of weather is any indication. This information that I got is from the Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment that was done for the West Cascades and is currently in press, I believe is available online. And what we can see, if you look at the graphs here, if you look at the upper graph that's looking at mean annual temperature changes through time, it's definitely getting warmer overall, and that's not just the average temperature, but also each season is showing warming, with the most pronounced season being summer, with a potential increase up to 11 degrees by 2100. So that warming effect is really meaning a extended growing season for landscapes in our part of the world. And as you can see from the lower panel, which is looking at annual precipitation changes through time, annual precipitation, so total precipitation, doesn't appear to be shifting too much through time. However, there is going to be seasonal shifts in precipitation, with an increase in winter precipitation and a decrease in spring, and especially a decrease in summer precipitation, which we don't have very much of to begin with. So what that means is potential increase in moisture stress of the vegetation that occurs in our area, and a higher probability of drought. And I would say that also, if we think about it, even though we're seeing increases in winter precipitation because temperatures are going to be a lot warmer, we're going to see decreases in persistent snowpack, which means we're going to see decreases in water storage capacity. And what does that mean for fire? It means probably an increase in the length and severity of the fire season. So one way to look at how that might play out in the future is to take a look at large wildfire suitability. And this is some work that Ray Davis and his cohorts did. And I really like it because it does give you an idea of how fire might be interacting with our landscapes in the future. What he did was he took a look at what's driving wildfires today. And no surprise, it really is related to that fire behavior triangle of fuels, weather, and topography. And then he looked at what can we predict into the future. And topography is not going to change. And it's going to be very difficult to predict the exact fuel trajectory, both vertical as well as horizontal into time. So the only thing that we really can look at is how climate is going to influence weather. And so, influence fire. And so what this wildfire suitability is really telling us is more, what is the probability that this potential site is going to be suitable for a large wildfire, and not necessarily what is the effect of that large wildfire going to be. So I want to just make sure that's clear. And I think what you can see here in these two panels, where he looked at kind of the near future and then the further out future, and although I don't have the Willamette mapped in here, what you can see is that in the not too distant future, many of our landscapes are going to be more suitable for wildfire. So it's not going to be a question of if we're going to have fire in our future. It's really a question of more, when are we going to have fire in our future? By 2100, most of the Willamette is going to be moderately or highly suitable for large wildfires to move through our forests. So it really behooves us to think about the fact that with high suppression costs and our potential lack of ability to fully suppress fires, how do we want to strategize on creating resilient landscapes and helping to influence what our future relationship with fire might be. So that's it.
Thank you, Jane. That was a whirlwind tour of all things fire.
I could have spent probably 45 minutes on any one of those topics. So.
If anybody has any questions, let's have 5 or 10 minutes before we move into Matt. If you want to put the question in the chat, that's fine, or raise your hand and I will call on you. Dwayne Bishop, you're up.
Hey, I have to run to another meeting, but Jane, once again, you killed it. That was awesome. So Molly and I, during this whole thing, were Skyping back and forth saying, this is all great stuff. And this feeds a lot of the NEPA that the Middle Fork is doing and whatnot. And, this is a conversation we've had for a very, very long time based on a lot of science you've done on the district. So I've got to run to another meeting, but I just wanted to point out that that was great, Jane. And it's wonderful to see you, and glad you're in retirement. So with that, I'll turn off my camera. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Dwayne.
Other quick questions for Jane before anything that you needed some burning clarification on? No pun intended. RRR. Joe, see your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, I put a question in. This question of reburn, and that if there's a phenomenon of reburn, and that it puts the forest, it creates a different sort of successional stage, and if it only burns once. Is there anything to discuss there, Jane? It seems like I hear a lot about it at times, but I didn't really see much of it in your talk.
Yeah, and I think Matt's going to cover a little bit of it in his talk. But yes, that has been a big question, and it makes some sense if we think about the immediate fuel trajectory after a fire. That and I think again Matt's going to talk about this a little bit, so I won't go into much detail on it. I think it's difficult historically to get evidence of reburn because the tools that we use to basically say we've had a fire in this area is either fire scars or regeneration. And so I think it's difficult to pick up on multiple burning in over a pretty short time period. But no doubt that it did occur. And I think it is a topic that we need to discuss a little bit. But I think I'm going to hold off and wait till Matt talks, and then maybe we can have a more comprehensive conversation around it. Is that all right, Joe?
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Jane.
Well, let's go ahead and move on to Matt. Thank you, Jane, and we'll bring you back here in about a half an hour when Matt's finished. Matt, were you able to figure out how to share your screen? Yay, he did. Oh, cool. So a reminder,
Yes,
Matt
I have
Powers
success.
is assistant professor at OSU. His favorite thing in life is to interact with us managers. So we're very lucky to have him and have that kind of partnership. So Matt, you're on.
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl, and thanks to Jane for that great presentation on sort of fire history and fire ecology in the region. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we can try to take some of what we've learned from managing fire behavior and fire effects through silvicultural activities in other ecosystems across the West, and think about how we might apply it in our West Side forests in the West Central Cascades. And I'll note right off the bat that I've got one or two pictures in here, like this one of the Holiday Farm fire that are uncredited from Wendy Peterman, but thanks for sharing those with me, Wendy. And I'll also note that Jane and I have been involved in developing some literature syntheses that I'm drawing on pretty heavily for this presentation. One of those, which really focuses on sort of stand scale fire effects, this one over on the left is currently available on the EcoShare website. And the second one that focuses more on implications for how fuel treatments might impact landscape scale fire behavior and effects is currently in progress and should be up on EcoShare in sometime in the coming weeks. So those resources are either currently out there or soon to be out there to help provide a little more synthesis of some of what we know about managing fire behavior and effects. And I guess as a starting point for my presentation, I'll go back to just reminding you or reiterating some things Jane said, just so that we're all on the same page in terms of terminology I might be using. When I'm talking about fire behavior, I'm talking about the way fire reacts basically to the characteristics of the landscapes it's burning across, the vegetation, topography, etc., and the fire weather conditions it's burning under. And that includes things like rate of spread and fire line intensities, which we might estimate with flame lengths or something like ERC, the energy release component. And it also includes whether we're seeing primarily surface fire behavior, which Jane described, whether we're seeing active crown fire with fire transmission from crown to crown in the overstory, or whether we're seeing torching, so fire burning up through, basically burning up into tree canopies and passive crown fire intermixed with potentially surface fire behavior. So again, fire behavior, when I'm talking about it, is just referring to all the ways fire interacts with the characteristics of the landscape and the weather conditions that it's burning under. And I'll contrast that with fire effects, which is basically the outcomes or impacts of the fire on the environment, right? And that can include a lot of things from consuming a biomass. Jane described some of the nutrient flux associated with fire and associated with the consumption of biomass on the forest floor, litter and duff. We might see altered soil and seedbed environments. It can include some of the ecological filtering effects that Jane referred to in terms of differential species survival or creating conditions that may differentially foster regeneration of some fire-adapted species over others. And it includes things like crown scorch, so just foliage that's killed by rising hot gases during a fire, as well as tree mortality. or vegetation mortality in general, which we might use to describe fire severity. In addition to altered microclimates that impact successional dynamics after the fire as a result of tree mortality and changes in soil conditions and so on. So fire behavior, when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about the way fire responds to the landscape and the fire weather conditions it's burning under. When I'm talking about fire effects, I'm basically going to be talking about these outcomes of fire on the environment and ecosystems that it burns through. Okay, so how do we think about managing fire behavior and effects when we open up our sort of silvicultural toolbox and think about what we can and can't do on the landscape? Primarily, we think about that in the context of managing fuel characteristics, which is the live and dead vegetation, any of the combustible materials on those landscapes. And we do this in a variety of ways. We manage the total amount of fuels, fuel loadings. We manage the vertical and horizontal distribution of fuels within stands to affect the potential for fire transmission from, for instance, tree canopy to tree canopy, as well as the potential for fire transmission from, from surface fires up into those tree canopies that might promote crown fire behavior. And the other thing we can think about in terms of how our management influences fire behavior and fire effects is the ways our management influences species composition, right? So we can manage for different suites of species that might be more resistant to fire or more resilient in terms of better adapted to regenerating after fire. And we have to think about these things not just at the stand scale, but also at the landscape scale in terms of how different patch types, vegetation types across the landscape might interact with topography and consequently major drivers of fire behavior to influence differential fire effects across the landscape, right? Which we can think about here in this picture with Young Plantation here in the foreground, where we basically had high severity fire, near total mortality, in contrast with the mature stands on either side of it, where we do see some mortality patches from crown scorch, but by and large we have significantly higher rates of survival after that fire, and we were seeing probably more of a relatively low severity surface fire behavior burning through those more mature areas. So we have to think about how these different conditions across the landscape interact with and are affected by our management, and how that in turn influences fire behavior and effects. Okay, and one of the ways we think about that classically is by thinking about sort of distributions and continuity of different types of fuels. Jane mentioned aerial fuels, surface fuels, and ladder fuels. I'll just reiterate, if we're talking about surface fuels, we're talking about any live and dead combustible biomass that's near the ground surface. So that's the forb layer, the tree seedlings, saplings, shrubs, deadwood, litter, things along those lines. Then when we talk about ladder fuels, those are the fuels that are that contribute to transmitting fire from surface fuels up into forest canopies. And basically ladder fuels, we're talking about stuff above the surface fuels that creates that vertical continuity between surface fuels and then overstory canopies. So that might include, forest mid-story layers, things along those lines. But it could also include, I guess I should also say, ladder fuels could also include in some of our forests things like lichens and dead branches and so on that could all transmit fire if they're sufficiently dry. And then we think about our aerial fuels, which are basically everything that's up in the main forest canopy, the live and dead combustible material up there that's suspended well above the ground surface. And when stuff up there is burning, whether it's live foliage or dead foliage or branches or lichens or whatever, that's what's contributing to crown fire behavior. All right, so classically, we often talk about some basic principles of fuel reduction to consider within the context of management activities on the landscape and silvicultural activities. And I'll give a brief overview of those and then think about how different treatments that we might be using in west side forests like the Willamette contribute to some of the effects that we're trying to achieve through these different principles of fuel reduction. So the first basic principle of fuel reduction is to reduce surface fuels. And the idea here is by reducing surface fuels, You reduce fire line intensities. You reduce how hot the fire is burning as it burns through the fuels that tend to drive primary fire behavior, the surface fuels. And the management outcomes we're trying to achieve by reducing surface fuels are basically reduce the amount of heat that vegetation is experiencing, so that increases the likelihood that you get tree survival or decreases the likelihood of mortality. Reduce the potential for torching. If we have lower fire line intensities, we have lower flame lengths. That means we need basically higher wind speeds in order to initiate torching typically. So that's going to reduce the likelihood that we get fire transmitting up into the crowns of trees. And also we think about reducing surface fuels to create conditions that are safer for access during wildland firefighting operations in order to facilitate suppression or protection activities around high value resources like communities in the WUI. Our second major principle of fuel reduction is increasing the height to the base of live crowns of trees. And the basic idea here is that we're trying to generate the effect of reducing the likelihoods of crown fires by requiring longer flame lengths in order to initiate torching, longer flame lengths in order to initiate fire burning up into tree canopies. Right, the farther those tree canopies are off the ground, the more intense fire behavior we need to initiate torching that would contribute to crown fire. And the management outcomes we're trying to generate here are essentially reduce the likelihood of torching, associated with that reduce the likelihood of crown fire and potentially reduce overstory mortality. Our third principle is essentially focused on decreasing crown densities in the overstory, so decreasing the density of those aerial fuels. Right, you can think about this as just reducing tree densities or reducing the amount of leaf area or leaf biomass that's up in those aerial fuels. And the basic effect we're trying to achieve here is to reduce the probability of transmission of fire from one tree crown to the next tree crown, so reduce the probability of active crown fires or active crown fire spread. And by doing so, hopefully we achieve the outcome of reducing mortality. But also we could add to that facilitating, safer access for firefighting operations as well. The last principle we'll talk about is focused more on creating vegetation that's more resistant and resilient to fire. So the principle is basically to promote the retention or maintenance of a component of large diameter trees of fire resistant species across the landscape. So, in Jane's talk, she mentioned some of those trees that are relevant to our West Side forest, species like Douglas fir, sugar pine, and incense cedar, for instance. And the idea here is that by increasing the representation of these fire resistant species and sizes of trees, we reduce the likelihood of mortality at any given fire intensity. So we have more potential for trees to survive fire, and that contributes to reduced likelihood of high severity fire, reduced likelihood of high degrees of mortality, but it also contributes to increased ecosystem resilience following fire, because if we have more seed trees surviving a fire, that means more potential seed sources, as well as a more moderated microclimate in that post-fire environment. All right, so let's think about some of the kinds of treatments that we might be using in West Side forests already, or might think about using in West Side forests that could, and how they, and think about how those different kinds of silvicultural treatments could contribute to these four basic principles of fuel reduction. And we'll start with basically, treatments designed to reduce overstory densities. So that is analogous to that reducing crown density principle of fuel reduction. And typically, the primary treatments here are mechanical density reductions via activities like thinning. Right? And the second category of treatments that we'll think about are treatments designed specifically to reduce surface fuels. And typically this involves fire, whether it's broadcast burns in terms of prescribed fire, or pile and burn operations, or even managed wildfire use, right? The managed use of wildland fires that might ignite and are consuming surface fuels. But there are some other things that we could be doing in our forests, or choices we could be making involved in timber harvesting activities that can also influence surface fuel abundances, right? One of the things that happens when we cut trees is we can leave slash on the ground, and that represents surface fuels. And we can reduce the degree to which harvests affect slash levels or increase slash levels by doing, whole tree yarding and skidding. Because that's taking those tops and branches and all the foliage in those tree crowns out to the landings where they can be either chipped and removed from the site or piled and burned more readily. And then the third major category of treatments we'll talk about and discuss are sort of combination treatments. So treatments that are designed both to reduce surface fuels and to reduce overstory densities. I'm just going to talk about these as thin and burn treatments. So treatments that combine mechanical density reductions such as thinning with surface fuel treatments such as broadcast burning. Over here on the west side, we don't do nearly as much broadcast burning as we see in, the inland Northwest, on the east side of the Cascades, or down in the Sierras or the Southwest or places like that. But it is still a tool that we potentially have access to and want to think about. Okay, so let's think about how these three categories of sort of silvicultural activities, thinning, focused on overstory density reduction, burning treatments that are focused on surface fuel reductions, and then the combination of the two are going to correspond to changes in those sort of four major principles of fuel reduction. And let's start with overstory density reductions, like thinning. Right, when we think about the impacts of thinning on surface fuels, in the short to medium term, thinning is going to increase slash loading, which is an increase in dead surface fuels. And that can have implications for fire line intensities in future fires. In the short term, thinning also tends to knock back or reduce the cover of understory vegetation, live vegetation, so reduce the cover of live surface fuels. Although we know in our west side forests in the medium to long term, particularly our sort of middle to lower elevation west side forests, when we go in and thin 10 to 20 years post thinning, we see more understory veg cover, more tree seedlings, and a more well-developed tall shrub layer than we do in the absence of that thinning treatment. So in the short term, we reduce kind of live fuels, but in the long term, we probably increase the abundance of live fuels via thinning. Thinning's impacts on crown base heights really vary depending on the thinning method we use. That is, depending on choices we make when selecting trees to cut or leave that are based on that tree's social position or crown class. Our most common thinning method in west side forests is thinning from below, where we're preferentially removing trees from lower crown classes or lower social positions. And thinning from below consistently increases crown base heights. But some of our other thinning methods where we might be preferentially removing trees from the upper crown classes, like thinning from above or dominant thinning, those tend to not have much of an impact on crown base heights. So our choice of thinning method really drives whether or not mechanical treatments are going to have an impact on raising crown base heights, and associated with that have an impact on affecting the likelihood of torching. Right, and thinning, is designed as a treatment to reduce crown densities, or to reduce tree densities, which in turn reduces crown densities. So we expect crown densities to be reduced following thinning treatments, but the degree to which they're reduced really depends based on thinning intensity. So, the percentage of basal area or stand density that we're removing in an entry and the residual densities that we're going to be leaving are big drivers of how much thinning impacts crown densities. Right, and then with our final principle, we can think about thinning's impacts on tree sizes and tree species and size distributions. And the degree to which thinning impacts these things depends on a variety of factors that go into developing our marking guides, including what thinning method we choose, right? So if we're thinning from below, we're preferentially removing trees from lower crown classes. That tends to leave residual stands with larger mean diameters because we're leaving the larger trees in the stand, so we can shift size distributions up. That tends to promote increased likelihood of survival during a fire event. But we also make choices in putting our marking guides together in terms of preferential retention or removal of different species, and we can start thinking about how we might alter those choices in order to increase resistance and resilience to fire based on some of the differential species potentials for survival and regeneration after fire that Jane talked about. Right, then we can think about burning treatments and how they correspond to these 4 principles of fuel reduction. Right, burning treatments are designed to reduce surface fuels, and that happens whether we're doing prescribed fire or whether we have a wildfire burn through an area. So we tend to see reductions in dead surface fuels and reductions as well as reductions in live surface fuels. But one of the interesting things about running prescribed fires through our west side stands is that in some of our moist west side systems, particularly our Western Hemlock series systems, we can have a lot of small understory trees, right? We can have this understory tree seedling and sapling component understory cohort at fairly high densities in some cases. And when we run, research suggests that when we run fires through those kinds of stands, we end up killing those small trees, which in the short term is reducing surface fuels. But a few years after those small trees are killed, we start seeing litter fall from their dead foliage and branches. And then over subsequent years, the inputs of new snags as those small trees fall over following their death. So we can see an interesting sort of temporal dynamic in some stands where we have high numbers of small trees. Where burning can, in the short term, reduce surface fuels, but then if we look 3 to 5 years after burning, we might actually see an uptick in surface fuels from the inputs of all those small trees. And just like with thinning, we see vegetation recovery over time following burning. So the live fuels are going to increase over time following burning. And the rate of that increase is going to depend on how open the canopy is, so how much light is available to promote understory vegetation growth, as well as the productivity of the system. Right, then we can think about burning treatment's impacts on crown base height. And fire has the surface fire, I should say, like broadcast prescribed burns, has the potential to increase crown base heights if it's successful in killing small trees. So if you can kind of reduce some of that ladder fuel component, which is most likely when that ladder fuel component consists of fire susceptible species, like some of our shade tolerant conifers in west side forests. When we think about small ranfir and white fir or western hemlock or western red cedar, things along those lines. But burning's impacts on crown base height can also extend to some degree of crown scorch, which can lead to the mortality of lower branches in the overstory if we have sufficiently hot, fire environments, so sufficient fire line intensities. Fire as a treatment that we're prescribing tends to be a treatment where we're looking for relatively low severity. We're not trying to kill a bunch of overstory trees typically when we're prescribing broadcast burns. And as a result, burning as a silvicultural treatment tends to have relatively little impact on crown density. So we don't tend to break up the continuity of those aerial fuels that much. But fire's use as a silvicultural treatment can have pretty significant impacts on tree species and size distributions, right? It tends to kill smaller fire-sensitive species while having much less impact on larger diameter and fire-resistant species. And then when we think about combining thinning treatments that are designed to reduce overstory densities with burning treatments that are designed to reduce surface fuels, we kind of get the best of both worlds, because we overcome some of the potential shortcomings of both of those individual treatment types, right? We end up with reduced surface fuels because even if we have increased slash levels after our thinning operation, we can reduce them with a subsequent broadcast burn. We're typically going to see increases in crown base heights, although the degree to which those base heights increase, again, depends on our thinning method. They're going to increase most when we're thinning from below. We typically are going to see reductions in crown densities, although again, the degree to which that occurs depends on our thinning intensities. And we're typically going to see impacts on species composition and size distribution that are consistent with the principles I talked about for thinning and burning individually. Okay, so how can some of these kinds of treatments impact fire severity, or more generally, how can stand structures impact fire severity? And then we'll talk a little bit about how they can impact fire behavior. we have some general lessons that we've learned from drier mixed conifer forests across the West. And those lessons are basically that denser stands with higher basal area and biomass are often more associated with high severity fire. And dense overstories with multi-layered canopies tend to contribute to greater risk of crown fire and associated with that greater risk of high severity fire. This speaks a little towards the question about, reburn situations. In situations where a past disturbance, whether that was a fire or some other kind of disturbance agent, contributes to the development of, dense shrub-dominated early seral systems, those systems tend to burn at higher severities as well. So these are lessons from drier conifer forests across the West. But there's some research that suggests at least a few sort of different ecosystem responses in our somewhat moister Douglas fir forests on the west side of the Cascades. One of the things that's pretty consistent is that dense stands of small diameter young trees are very susceptible to high severity fire. But as we start looking at mature and older stands in our west side forests, when those mature stands have high levels of large tree cover, they tend to experience proportionally less high severity fire than the surrounding landscape. So that's a bit of a difference from our drier forest types. That's not to say that mature stands of larger diameter trees with dense canopies in west side forests can't burn at high severity. They can, but they may be at lower risk of high severity. Studies suggest they might be at lower risk of high severity fire than younger stands, essentially. And then tree size and species composition heavily influence the risk of tree mortality in our west side forests, right? If we've got stands of very thin bark fire susceptible species like alder or western hemlock, even a relatively low intensity surface fire is more likely to cause significant levels of mortality than if we have a mature stand of large diameter Douglas fir, where you're going to have thick bark and crowns high off the ground. In which case we're probably only likely to see significant levels of mortality if we have fires that are burning under really extreme weather conditions like September's fire last year. Another thing that kind of differentiates our at least our moist west side Doug fir western hemlock type systems from the drier mixed conifer systems and ponderosa pine systems, where a lot of the sort of fuel treatment effects research has been done, is that our sort of late successional old growth west side systems tend to have these really patchy canopies, which affects kind of the continuity of aerial fuels across the landscape and can influence the potential for active crown fire, right? So we might have a lot of vertical continuity of fuels because of the multi-layered nature of the canopies in our old growth west side systems. So that can lead to torching, but we oftentimes have these relatively widely spaced large diameter overstory trees that can reduce continuity within that aerial fuel layer that might reduce the likelihood of active crown fire spread. At least require more severe weather conditions to promote active crown fire spread. Right, and Jane covered this, so I won't spend much time on it, but when we look at our west side systems, there are a few species that have a lower probability of mortality or higher likelihood of survival during wildfires, and those include Douglas fir, incense cedar, and sugar pine, shown here on the top. And then some groups of species that are much more susceptible to fire or have greater risk of mortality, and those include things like western hemlock, red cedar, and true firs like white fir and grand fir and subalpine fir and Pacific silver fir. For most of these species, what we typically see is as tree diameter increases, bark thickness increases, so the potential to survive fire starts to go up. And that increase in bark thickness happens more rapidly in our fire resistors like Doug fir and incense cedar and sugar pine. But there are a few species like western hemlock and red alder where we don't really see significant increases in bark thickness as they get larger. So even larger diameter trees of those species don't tend to have much resistance to fire. Right, so we see these differential impacts of fire across species that we can think about when we're considering developing marking guides for things like thinning. All right, Now we'll try to sort of wrap up here by thinking about some of the stand scale effects of fuel reduction treatments we might expect. And we'll start by thinking about impacts on fire severity, so mortality during fire events. And the literature pretty consistently finds that the combination of thinning and burning treatments, so combining overstory density reductions with surface fuel reductions, tends to be most effective at reducing wildfire severity. So those combination treatments tend to be more effective at reducing fire severity than just thinning or just burning. In fact, in some cases, thinning by itself, because it can increase surface fuels as a result of slash inputs, thinning by itself can actually result in increased fire severity compared to untreated stands. That's not always the case. There are examples, there are more examples in the literature of cases where thinning treatments actually do contribute to at least modest reductions in fire severity compared to untreated stands. But there are certainly examples out there where the increases in surface fuels that follow thinning treatments can contribute to higher severity fire than we would have seen without that treatment. So that's something to be aware of. And we need to think about, you know, how we might treat those surface fuels or reduce increases in surface fuels via things like whole tree yarding. Prescribed burning has generally been shown to reduce fire severity, and actually past wildfire has been shown to have similar impacts in terms of potential to reduce fire severity as prescribed burning has. But that depends a lot on sort of the severity of that past fire and what kinds of vegetation developed afterwards. And when we start looking at how fire weather conditions influence the effectiveness of these different categories of treatments, what we generally find is that as fire weather becomes more extreme, as we start moving into 97th or 98th or 99th percentile fire weather conditions, the effectiveness of all of these different types of treatments, you know, burning, thinning, or the combination of burning and thinning, is reduced, but not eliminated. And that's particularly true for treatments that involve fire and overstory density reduction. So for our thin and burn treatments, retrospective studies after fires, as well as simulations in a variety of different systems across the West, suggest that while the effectiveness of those treatments at reducing fire severity is reduced under extreme weather conditions, you still see lower fire severity in treated areas than in untreated areas. So we have to adjust our expectations accordingly based on what kinds of conditions, you know, what weather conditions fires are burning under. Right, and then let's think a little bit about impacts of these treatments on fire behavior, right? So again, that's how fire burns across the landscape, and things like rate of spread and fire line intensities and potentially fire extent. Right, and generally studies find that treatments involving surface fuel reductions, like broadcast burning, particularly when those surface fuel reductions are combined with thinning, are the most effective treatments at reducing fire line intensities, right? So when we do these broadcast burns or thin and burn operations, or even past wildfires that, you know, consume significant amounts of surface fuels, that tends to reduce, you know, fire line intensities in later wildfires. Thin and burn treatments have been shown to pretty consistently promote shifts from crown fire behavior in adjacent untreated areas to lower intensity surface fires within usually just tens of meters of entering an area that received a thin and burn treatment. So they promote a pretty rapid shift in that aspect of fire behavior. And there's some research, although this isn't a heavily studied topic, there's some research from drier conifer forests that suggests fuel treatments, so density reductions combined with broadcast burns after those thinnings that involve unharvested leaf islands or skips, typically have a somewhat weaker effect on moderating fire behavior as well as fire severity than more uniform density reduction. So that's something to consider as well as we're thinking about, you know, implementing variable density thinning and things along those lines versus conventional commercial thinning in combination with understory fuel reduction treatments. All right, so that's a lot of consideration of how some of our different kinds of fuel treatment options might impact fire behavior within the treated area at the stand scale. But what we really want to think about, you know, in the bigger picture is how doing some of these treatments might impact the way fire burns across the larger landscapes we manage, right? And there is a body of research that looks at those kinds of questions using a combination of, wildfire simulation approaches, as well as retrospective studies where we go in and look at patterns of fire spread and fire severity following wildfire events that have affected landscapes that had fuel treatments within the burned area. And generally, the potential for fuel treatments to impact landscape scale burn patterns is really based on the way they impact rates of fire spread and fire transmission across the landscape. So what we see is as fire burns across treated units, which in the picture over here are the black polygons, as fire approaches those treated units and then burns around them, as it starts burning around the sides and then filling back in on the leeward side of those treated areas, the fire behavior changes from a head fire, so that's a fire that's running, downwind. It's running spread in the direction of the wind, to flanking or backing fires, which tend to burn at lower intensities and tend to spread it at slower rates, right? So these placement of fuel treatments on the landscapes tends to contribute to changes in the rates at which fire burning and in fire line intensities in downwind areas beyond those treatments, in addition to within the treated areas themselves. And you can see that here in this picture, where we have kind of a complex of fuel treatments over here on the left. On the windward side of those fuel treatments down here, we saw a lot of moderate to high severity fire behavior. And on the leeward side of that complex of fuel treatments, we see a lot more of this, low to moderate severity fire behavior. And the literature that looks at the impacts of the, fuel treatments across the landscape and how much fuel treatments we place, that is the percentage of the landscape that is treated per year or decade, suggests some pretty consistent take-homes across a range of systems from, southwestern ponderosa pine to fairly moist, productive Doug fir, hemlock, red cedar forests in the northern Idaho and western Montana. We see some pretty consistent results. So one is that the application of fuel treatments at landscape scales tends to reduce mean fire sizes, so the average extent of fires. It tends to reduce burn probabilities, so the likelihood that, the average likelihood that any given place on that landscape is going to experience fire. And it tends to reduce fire spread rates. And we also see, as the graphs over here suggest, as we increase the proportion of the landscape that's treated per decade, so going from 10% to 50% in this particular study of the landscape treated per decade, we end up seeing increasing reductions in fire sizes and burn probabilities and spread rates, right? So if you treat more acres per year or per decade with fuel reduction treatments, you end up seeing bigger benefits in terms of impacts on subsequent fire behavior. But as these figures over on the left suggest, when we start looking at spread rates and burn probabilities and at mean fire sizes, and we start looking at the impact of treating increasing amounts of the landscape, what we see is sort of diminishing returns over time. So the literature basically suggests when we treat more than about 20% of the landscape per decade, which could be a lot of acres in a landscape like the Willamette National Forest, we start to see diminishing returns in terms of impacts on further moderation of fire effects and behavior. Right? And an encouraging thing from this literature is across a wide range of ecosystems, even fairly modest treatment rates that might be more achievable, like treating 5 to 10% of the acres on the landscape per decade, have been shown to have a moderating effect on things like fire spread rates and burn probabilities and fire line intensities and fire sizes. So heading into sort of wrapping up here, we talked about these impacts of fuel treatments at both stand to landscape scales. And one of the things we've got to keep in mind, though, is that fuel treatments are designed to influence fire behavior. They're designed to influence these characteristics of how fire burns across the landscape. They're not designed to stop fires. So while we might use fuel treatments to promote things like successful protection efforts of high value resources like office areas and housing, we can't expect those fuel treatments to just stop fire altogether, right? So we have to be thoughtful in our planning of the layout of fuel treatments in order to maximize its effectiveness at achieving whatever outcomes we're trying to achieve, whether that's protect high value resources or whether that's, reduce the average extent of fire on the landscape during bad fire years. And along with that, we have to think about potential treatment lifetimes. And those vary a lot depending on the type of vegetation the fire is burning through, the productivity of those ecosystems, which impacts fuel recovery times after treatments. And fire weather conditions, so more extreme fire weather conditions tend to reduce the effective lifetime of fuel reduction treatments in terms of their potential for moderating fire behavior. But typically what we see is that things like broadcast burning is effective at moderating fire behavior from anywhere from 5 to 15 years, probably on the shorter end of that if fire is burning under more severe weather conditions or extreme weather conditions. And things like thin and burn treatments tend to moderate fire behavior on the landscape for a little bit longer, maybe 10 to 20 or even 25 years. So we have to think about approaches for how we might place treatments across the landscape. And there's really three primary approaches that have been heavily studied. One is the use of some kind of heuristic optimization algorithms to come up with ideal solutions by running thousands of simulations of placing treatments at different places across the landscapes. Another is more deterministic placement based on a desire to protect specific resources or to reduce fire impacts on specific resources, might be a better way to say it. And the third is essentially random placement, which is to say putting fuel reduction treatments on the landscape, but having their placement driven by factors other than trying to sort of maximize the effectiveness of those treatments as fuel reductions. So that might be, having fuel reduction treatments associated with thinning being really driven by purely timber program considerations or something along those lines. And generally, studies that look at the use of optimization algorithms suggest that this approach is most effective at reducing the total extent of fire, so the average burn area per fire event, and reducing average fire line intensities across the landscape. So if we use these kind of heuristic optimization algorithms, those have the potential to reduce the total amount of fire and average intensity of fire across the landscape. And basically this research suggests what we should ideally do if we're trying to reduce that total amount of fire across the landscape is place treatments in the areas that have the highest probability of fire occurrence. So the highest probability of either ignition happening or of fire transmitting through that area because of how topography influences kind of fire transmission pathways across the landscape. In contrast, studies that look at placing fuel reduction treatments based on a desire to protect specific resources suggest that this approach is less effective at reducing sort of landscape scale fire benefits. So it's less effective at reducing average fire sizes and the average amount of area burned at high fire line intensities. But sort of deterministic fuel treatment placement based on specific resource values tends to be most effective at reducing risk to those specific resources, such as communities in the WUI. And then our least effective option is basically randomized placement of treatments across the landscape. I think I'm running a little long, so I'm going to skip through this slide real quick and just finish up with one other option for planning fuel treatments across the landscape. And that option is the utilization of existing planning frameworks that are developed for other purposes, such as pods, right? And pods are these spatial units that are designated based on an analysis of resource values across the landscape and fire risk to those values. And pods are really polygons that are created with the idea of facilitating wildfire management operations. But because built into their delineation, you have a consideration of where the high value resources are across the landscape and what the risk is to different pools of high value resources in different places across the landscape. Pods also have a really high potential value in use for planning things like fuel management treatments at landscape scales. And there's actually some research that's, provided examples of how we could go about utilizing pods for this kind of landscape scale fuel management planning and implementation. And I've provided an example of one of those studies here. So to wrap up, what are our broad conclusions? Basically, research strongly suggests that fuel treatment principles are applicable across a fairly wide range of systems, and that thin burn treatments that combine overstory density reductions with surface fuel reductions, are most effective at moderating both fire behavior and fire effects at stand to landscape scales. But we have to be cognizant that extreme fire weather conditions are likely to reduce the effectiveness of these treatments. And we have to consider the landscape context in planning where these treatments are going to go and timeframes for implementation. And finally, we have to consider trade-offs between, trying to maximize different potential benefits of placing fuel management treatments across the landscape. Are we trying to protect specific high-value resources, or are we trying to reduce the extent or a total extent of fire or the extent of high-severity fire on average across the whole landscape? And I'll wrap up with just saying what we ultimately need to do is make sure we are keeping our expectations realistic, right? There's potential for fuel treatments to influence fire behavior and fire effects in our west side systems. We need probably more research in these systems to really maximize that potential and incorporate considerations of fire behavior into our planning and implementation processes. But we need to recognize that these types of treatments aren't designed to stop fire. They're not going to be effective at stopping fires, particularly under extreme fire weather conditions. What they can potentially do is reduce impacts on resource values. So I think the big questions moving forward are how and when should we apply these different fuel reduction principles in our west side forests, and how do we leverage existing resources like pods planning frameworks that we see over here on the right in order to optimize our fuel treatment planning and implementation at larger landscape scales. So that's where I'll leave off, and I apologize, I ran a little bit longer than I had planned there, but if we've got time, I'm happy to stick around for some questions.
Thank you, Matt. That was wonderful. A lot of information. I think we could have done this as a half-a-day webinar. Thank you, everybody, for hanging in there. I did put in the chat that we're going to go ahead and extend this webinar for folks who want to hang around and ask questions in person. But if you have to leave and you just want to put a question in the chat, I will collect those chats and we'll email you back an answer as soon as we can. So we want to make sure we respond to your questions. So Jane, if you want to come back on and show your face, we'll open it up to both of you folks for questions. If you want to just raise your hand and I will call on you. Or put your question in the chat if you're shy, that's fine too. Maybe we can circle back to, Chris has got us. We can circle back to Joe first. Let's do that because that was something we left hanging for your talk, Matt. So Joe, why don't you go first?
Hey, sorry to always be asking questions, but actually I have another question. I would be interested in knowing what you know about, if there's anything you can say about reburn, because I'm thinking in the context of, if you have a big mega fire, are you set up for resiliency, or is something going to come back that you're going to have future fires that are going to make even a worse condition? Is there anything you do? So that's the question of that. But I'm also interested in this. So one of the concepts is these dense forests that are really fire risks are valuable for all kinds of wildlife habitat, like spot owls and lynx and stuff in dry forests. And so the thought has always been that, I guess the thought has been from the spot owl people is that we can do this fire stuff, but we can leave these blocks of multi-layered stands with high fuel levels and stuff. And I just wanted to know how that works in your idea, Matt. I mean, does that fit in if you're looking at core areas, if you're leaving, say, in a 500-acre block, you're leaving 50, 60% in, multi-layered, ladder fuel type forest, maybe every, 2,500 acres across the landscape. Does that work in terms of reducing fire risks?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll take a stab at it, and then maybe Jane can weigh in as well. There's a couple of considerations here. One is just the more area on the landscape that we have restrictions on the ability to implement fuel reduction treatments, the more it reduces the potential impacts of those treatments at landscape scales. And that's supported by, again, research from other systems, so systems in the Sierras, in the Southwest, and in the Northern Rockies. So basically, the more landscape you designate as areas where you're not going to be able to conduct field treatments because it's a late successional reserve that's over 80 years old, or it's designated wilderness, or it's roadless, and the more you constrain your ability to implement different kinds of treatments in those areas, the less effective any sort of planned fuel management will be at impacting landscape scale patterns of fire behavior. But the research also suggests we can still impact landscape scale fire behavior, even in landscapes where 90% of the landscape is non-treatable within the context of applying fuel treatments. The second piece of the question is really related to susceptibility of those systems, these older multi-layered systems to fire. And I touched on this a little, and Jane touched on this a little. And certainly when we have, a continuity of fuels, that has the potential to increase the risk of high severity crown fire, particularly when we have extreme fire weather conditions. With that said, what we find in these west side forests is the fire refugia, the places that tend to burn at lower severity or not burn at all, tend to be associated with these forests that have high densities of large tree cover and oftentimes more complex multi-layered crown structure. So we have kind of this trade-off to analyze, which is those forests are potentially the ones that are more likely to survive fire, certainly compared to our young plantations. But at the same time, we recognize that the structure of those forests could, under extreme fuel, moisture, and fire weather conditions, make them prone to having high severity crown fires. So maybe part of what we have to consider is when we let fires burn in these forests to reduce some of the fuels that are available when we do have potential for fire under severe fire weather conditions. And with that said, I'll toss it over to Jane.
Yeah, I think Matt hit on some of what I was going to say, which location is really a key. We have to look, so we have to also look at landscape context. So I think a late cereal forest that's next to a plantation is going to react differently than a late cereal forest that's adjacent to other structures. So that really argues, I think, for a need, especially in our fire regimes, to take a very large landscape approach, because every stand doesn't burn in a vacuum. It's really affected by the structures and compositions of adjacent stands. So I think we need to be looking strategically at how we place these different structures and compositions on the landscape to really create the most resilient landscape. So, and I think the other point I want to make, which is kind of added to what Matt was saying, was that not all fires are the same. We've already talked about that, right? And so maybe allowing certain kinds of fires into some of our late successional forests might actually serve to reduce the probability of high mortality under certain fire weather conditions. So I think we have to be open, a little more open than we have in the past, to allowing fire into those systems. And then, like I said, be a little more strategic than we have been in the past in terms of how we arrange our different types of stands across the landscape to protect the resources that we are interested in protecting.
So no easy answer to your question, Joe. Location, location, location. Let's move to James Rudisill. You had a question, James? Go ahead.
Hey, Matt. Good morning. Nice presentation and you do, Jane.
You're a little quiet, James.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is that better?
Nope, not much.
Oh, interesting. Let me see here. Computer. Is that better?
Nope,
That's a little better, yeah.
a little better. Go for it. We'll see if we can catch it.
So, question for you, Matt, and Jane tying too is in Jane's presentation, she talked. What we all know is that Doug fir does take fire better than some species on the west side here. What are your thoughts about running prescribed fire through thinnings in plantations? When we've thinned some 12, 13-inch stuff. I know we've done it, but you really have to take a lot of time to keep from, those young trees have thinner bark. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, you highlighted, I think, one of the two major considerations, and one of the major considerations is how old is that plantation? How large are the trees on average? And as a result, what is the risk of mortality in those trees? And it's probably not going to be that feasible to run prescribed fire through, really early stem exclusion. 20 right after canopy closure, 25-year-old, maybe up to 40-year-old stands, something like that, until you start getting to the point where you're getting, 16. This don't take this number as gospel, but you start getting 14, 16 plus inch diameter trees that are starting to develop that increasingly thick bark. And actually, there's some cues we can take there from some of the work that Chris Dunn and John Bailey, and as well as James Johnston, have done on the Middle Fork and on the tiller district of the Umpqua, looking at susceptibility of Doug fir and other species to fire at different sizes, right? And you really start seeing an increase in the probability of surviving fire in Doug fir when you start getting above about, let's see, I'm translating in my mind from centimeters to inches, above about 6 in that 16 to 20 inch range is where you start seeing an increase in their probability of surviving fire, or a reduction in their probability of mortality. So I would be thinking about that. How old is this plantation, and how large are those trees? And the other thing I would be thinking about is, just how much surface fuels are going to be on the ground when I'm running that fire through, because that's going to impact fire line intensities. Both the abundance of the surface fuels, and then how much of particularly the larger fuels that are going to drive areas that burn at high heat loads for longer periods of time, which is going to promote more potential mortality.
So with
Well,
that answer, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to add to what Matt said in terms of thinking about using fire as a tool, because fire is an awesome tool, but it's not a surgical tool in terms of us being able to predict exact outcomes on the acre or tree basis. So in some ways, I think prescribed fire is an awesome tool, and I think we need to maybe think about it in the precision level that it was designed to be used at. So we talk about creating snags in some of these plantations, and so fire would be a really great tool to allow for a little more mortality. Right now, when we burn in our plantations, we're so concerned about any kind of mortality that it creates a lot of conflict among resources. So I think we need to be a little more flexible about allowing a little mortality. And I would also say we could potentially be thinking about not just applying prescribed fire to that plantation, but think about prescribed fire in a broader sense, applying it across maybe a few plantations on that hillside, and the natural stands that are in between it, and take advantage of that tool, both as a fuels reduction tool and also as a mortality creating tool to create a few more snags on the landscape. I'll get off my soapbox.
That's good. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, James.
Yeah. Chris, got a question? Donaldson?
Yeah, and first off, thanks Cheryl for putting this all together, and Jane and Matt for putting this on. This has been great. You know, a lot of stuff, you know, shares similar soapboxes that I have, Jane. So I'm hearing also great questions as far as, you know, what Joe asked, what James brought up. So just really appreciate all of that. I guess one thing that I thought of, Jane, during your presentation, you know, we talked about tribal burning just a little bit, and, you know, fire in the Western Cascades is kind of a mystery looking back in some ways across the board. We can kind of piece some big chunks together, but there's so many little variables out there that we just don't have a good grasp on. I was wondering, is there any, you know, expectations or thought that some of that tribal burning will be able to piece a little bit more of that together, or is kind of what we know right now? I think about, you know, how we can look at the Willamette Valley and we can see a pretty clear picture of tribal influence in the Willamette Valley and how that burning changed that ecosystem. And we do a little bit of burning, you know, Camas Prairie and Sweet Home, some very key places on the forest that we know there was historic use of fire from the tribes, but I've always been really nervous to apply that too broad, kind of going back to what you mentioned, Matt, about realistic expectations, what Jane, you were just talking about the appropriate scale and tool. So we've talked about how like huckleberry production, a lot of those things were really big with the tribes, but actually recreating that and knowing, are we doing good? Are we doing the same processes that were historically there? Or are we kind of throwing a scalpel in a blender and we're not quite sure what's going to come out the other side? So just curious if there's any research or any other things out there that might be coming about, you know, what fire looked like on the Western Cascades historically from the tribes that might be there, or did we just kind of lose that knowledge?
Well, I'll start. I don't know that there has been a lot of information on pre-contact burning in the Willamette. You know, with the tools that we're using to look at fire history, you know, there's no, I always joke, there's no feather on in the fire scar to let you know that a Native American started this fire, you know, versus lightning. We really are only left with the fire effects. But I will say I think that there's been a lot more influence of pre-contact burning in our systems than we are led to believe. So I'm thinking back to some fire history work we did in the Augusta Creek area, which is up on the McKenzie district, and we found some interesting hot spots where fire burned much more frequently than the adjacent landscape. And we also knew that there was a fishing, I don't think it was a village, but there was a fishing camp below the area that we were seeing increased fire frequency from, which would lead us to think that perhaps that native burning played a role in that larger landscape. So I don't know that we're ever going to find out, you know, not just native, but also, you know, European burning. There's boatloads of burning with sheep herders, and, you know, we have records of that. So as I said in my talk, humans have played a huge role, and I don't know that we'll ever untangle that, nor do I necessarily think we have to. Matt, do you have anything to add?
I think that covered it pretty well. There is always going to be some uncertainties about the frequency of native burning, because it's hard to parse it out. It's hard to parse out sources of ignition, as well as the extent of its impact on the landscape. The only thing I'd add is we can probably make some assumptions based on what we do know about where native impacts on the landscape in general were greatest, and those were the areas where their use of fire probably had the highest frequency and the most impact in terms of influencing vegetation structure and composition.
I'm going to pull a question from the chat from Dill McCoy. I've heard some talking about thinning, opening up Cascade Forest to wind, and that leaving some fuels in place can help serve as a wind blocker and reduce potential for wind-based spread. What are your thoughts on this?
I'll go back to Jane's point about location is important to consider there, right? Risk of increased wind throw following, a stand density reduction is heavily influenced by where you are on the landscape and whether it's a landscape position that's exposed to, potential high winds. If you're in a ridgetop position or in a saddle, you have more potential wind exposure than if you're down in a valley. So location matters in that consideration. But with that said, while we've certainly seen examples of, wind events contributing to snap out and wind throw following thinning operations, or even following on some BLM land more retention style harvests. I suppose I tend to think of that as this is a disturbance process that generates something that's sometimes hard for us to generate on the landscape anyway. Getting to that point of using fire to create snags. Some degree of wind throw to create logs on the ground or trees with snapped out tops is probably not a terrible outcome. We might just want to be careful about how we're planning treatments in areas with high exposure to wind throw.
Well, and to add to that, if you're talking about wind speeds related to fire movement itself, again, I think diversity is the name of the game. Basically, we're not going to want to create huge tracts of open forest potentially in some areas. I think having diverse structures, diverse vertical as well as horizontal structures across the landscape is really going to be our best way to be able to modulate fire behavior and fire movement through systems. I think the key question that we haven't quite untangled yet is what's the grain size of that diversity? Is it a 50-acre grain size? Is it a 100-acre grain size? Is it a 1,000-acre grain size? I think that's something that we need to play around with a little bit more to see what scale we need to express that diversity to really create the most resilient landscapes. And we need to really be clear about what our definition of a resilient landscape is.
So Aaron Abernathy has their hand up. You want to go ahead, Aaron?
Hi, I'm actually curious. This has all been super informative. Thank you. I work in visitor services at the Middle Fork District, and we get a ton of calls about people that are just curious about fire in general. And I was just curious if there's any resource available for specifically the Willamette, what we're doing for fire restoration, and just any, all this information, if there's any unified place or a document that exists that I could send people when they ask questions about this sort of stuff.
I know way back when Katie Isaacson put together a few really nice little packets, and I don't know if you have those. It's not necessarily about fire specifically, but there's a big one about the Jims Creek Restoration project that had a section on fire on it, but I'm not aware of any handout that would work. But I think that's a great suggestion.
Yeah. There are some there's some nice resources on the OSU Fire Extension website that are geared towards the public and informing them in general about fire on the west side. So you might check in there. I think there's some handouts and things. It may not be Willamette specific, but it's probably appropriate to share for people walking in the front door or calling you.
Well, and I think we could probably pretty easily put something together, especially based on the two presentations that we put together today, that, if you're interested, definitely get in touch with me. I'd be happy to chat more with you about it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that sounds good, Jane. Thank you. Yeah, people are just really specifically curious about the Holiday Farm Fire and just everything that's happening up there. So if there's like any information that we can pass along to kind of let people know what's going on.
Okay.
And one thing I'm working on, just throw it out there, is updating our the Willamette National Forest webpage. Our fire management section of that is incredibly out of date, and so one thing I want to do is update our prescribed fire information, and just having that as a bit of a repository to at least point people in directions of other material. So that's something we'll be working on this summer. Hopefully by the fall we'll have a better product, so the forest can kind of highlight what fire is on the Willamette and point people in directions of other information.
Okay, well,
thanks, guys.
I'm going to go ahead and thank our speakers and wrap this up. Thank you all for hanging in there. It was a tremendous amount of information. The Willamette prides itself on strong science management partnerships, and it's lovely that we're able to pull these sorts of things together and share this best available science with folks. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to send them to me or to Matt or Jane. They're more than willing to have further dialogues about this topic. So thank you all. Have a good day, and we're hoping for summer, but a wet summer. What's the chance, right? Okay. See you all. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you all.
Great presentation.